here. Awesome. So we are all ready to go. Thank you for being on again. If you could just start off with a brief little intro about who you are and what you do, and then we can just get into everything.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Nick. I'm Jenn Swain. I'm the Global Senior Sustainability Manager at Burton Snowboards. So for us, sustainability applies to our operations globally, our product, as well as our work in marketing and advocacy. So it's kind of our impacts throughout the world in all ways.
Cool. And are you doing this from the offices there? I noticed obviously the Burton thing on the background behind you.
Yeah, I'm in our global headquarters in Burlington, Vermont.
Cool. Sweet. So that kind of brings me to my first question. Did you grow up in Vermont? Because I noticed that you obviously went to the university there. Is that kind of like home? Has that been home base?
Yeah, I grew up in Jericho, Vermont. It's about a half hour from Burlington. And I ended up going to UVM for undergrad and my master's. And I did the typical Burlingtonian thing of moving away for a bit, including to Boulder, Colorado, which is a standard destination. And I got back about 2 years ago to start this job at Burton.
Awesome. So yeah, what I thought was interesting was when I had like connected with you online, just your diverse background and kind of how much you have gotten into various different things. And I think for me, what I've always been interested in kind of as this sustainability thing has gotten a lot bigger over the last couple of years is people that have been doing it for longer than just this latest kind of rush or boom or whatever you want to call it. And so I'm interested in like all these different moving parts and how you've kind of been able to put those together. So could you go back and just start from the complete beginning, like before school? What got you interested in that route, and how did you choose to, start where you started?
Sure. I think growing up in Jericho actually was kind of what built the core of my environmentalism, just my personal values. And then I kind of picked up on the social pieces along the way. But when you're in a small town in Vermont, it takes a bit of traveling and school to kind of open your mind to the rest of the world, everything else out there. I actually have been passionate about sustainability and interested in corporate sustainability since probably my freshman or sophomore year at UVM. And although I didn't plan my career path necessarily, looking back, it all kind of makes sense for ending up in the position I'm in now. So,
Gotcha. And how big is the town that you grew up in? How many people?
I want to say 11,000. There were no traffic lights when I was growing up.
That sounds like about similar to ours. I think where I grew up had maybe one. So we beat you at the traffic light situation. But that's cool. So you ended up getting into school and kind of found your, I guess, I want to use the word stumble, but I don't know if it necessarily felt like that. It's my word, not yours. Kind of, started to pick up on some of the things that you wanted to do. What did the schooling situation look like, and how did that all work out?
Yeah, so I started as an environmental studies major. I think I started trying to craft my kind of build your own major into something that would support corporate sustainability. And I think it was a sophomore course that was all about career development, I kind of realized through that course that actually I might be better suited to be in the community development program. So I ended up graduating actually with a community and international development background with a lot of coursework in environmental studies as well as ecological economics. And I was focused on food systems. So Vermont has a really strong local and organic food culture here. Its roots go back, well before I was in college, but it's really seen as a leader in that space in the United States, at least. So I kind of expected that I would end up more at like a coffee roaster and doing their, bean sourcing from South America or something of that nature. But I definitely had that same focus on corporate sustainability regardless. And not because I think that that's the only avenue to pushing sustainability, but because I believe that there is something to be said for kind of working from the inside to make changes, because I think there's the carrot and the stick, and I'd like to kind of be on the carrot side of the equation. And so from there, I kind of started to think about how I could build my own sustainability stool, the social, environmental, and economic, through education.
Gotcha. So how did you end up deciding that the corporate side of things is really the way that you wanted to do it? Because I think for me, that's kind of a similar understanding or belief that I've held, is like, regardless of if it's sustainability or not, when you want to try and create some more change, regardless of what it is, it helps to be able to do that from the inside. And it helps to be able to do that from the inside of some bigger companies. But to hold that idea at such a young age, it seems like what ended up getting you there before, getting into more of like a real world job type of scenario?
I think the young age was key because I couldn't have been jaded yet. um, there are a lot of companies out there that are purpose driven increasingly, and you see things like the benefit corporation movement, where companies, even large ones, are able to look beyond just shareholder value. I think that I had the benefit again of being in Vermont, where a lot of companies, seventh generation, Ben and Jerry's, were already speaking out on their values. And so that's who I was looking to as kind of my role model businesses, and where I would like to work, but also kind of as benchmarking for leadership and sustainability.
Interesting. It's interesting that you bring up Ben and Jerry's, because where I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, or around that area, Ben and Jerry's had a huge plant, and I just remember all the stuff going around that growing up, and just kind of like being in the background, which was interesting. But yeah, so can you explain a little bit more about you had mentioned the more of the sustainability route within school, but then also kind of like the social community driven side. What are the differences in curriculum and what you're being taught, and how you're kind of like using that to actually create some sort of change in the real world through schooling?
I think that my experience, and I think this is changing, but my experience at university was that the environmental piece and the social piece were too often kept separate. And also that the only intersection was seen as kind of where there are impacts on both environmental and human health. For instance, with bioaccumulation, it's kind of the classic example. Something gets into the environment, it accumulates in fish, for instance, and it moves up the food chain until the human eats it. But I think there's a lot of other intersections that are kind of either overlooked, or it's at a certain level of complexity that you don't want to try to capture that all in a single course.
Yeah.
So for me, the piece that I was focused on with community development was, again, much more tied to agriculture at the time, but generally looking more at base of the pyramid, kind of the communities that are creating kind of the raw materials that go into the products, more than those that are impacted, for instance, in the manufacturing chain. And so I think there were a lot of good takeaways that included the environment at that level, because you're thinking about things like shade-grown coffee, for instance, back to coffee. So, right, you have premiums paid to the farmers, and how does that show up in the community wellness? But also, how is it improving the environment or preserving biodiversity? So I think for me, it was more that it was clear that there are these three elements, right? And the economic piece is really important, because you can't have, for a corporation in particular, sustainability and profit be at odds. You need to be profitable in order to invest in preferred materials, better manufacturing, responsible social practices throughout the supply chain. So that was just kind of the take that I had, was that it was important to have an understanding, a solid understanding of all of those elements.
Gotcha. And that's the how they go about that side of things. So I'm going to have to pick your brain about some things to grill them on before I get them on. But that's really cool, and it's cool that you were able to kind of see that there needed to be more involved than just the one piece that you were getting. And I'm assuming, based on what you're explaining, there's got to be a lot more involved with the schooling than just kind of like you were saying, one piece of it, where you're having to pull in science and business and, you know, all these different things to really understand how they're all kind of connected. What did that start to look like as you got further along your schooling? And did you decide that you needed to go somewhere else, or how, because I'm assuming, if I'm putting myself in your shoes, there's all this stuff coming in. Like, what do you do with that?
Mm-hmm. I'll say two things. The first is that I was fortunate to be undergrad and, again, graduate school at a university that really valued service learning. And so a lot of the work that we were doing was not just case-based, but we would then apply our skills in order to make real change in the world. So through projects like working in Belize to establish a community orchard in an immigrant community, for instance. And so we were able to really apply practical knowledge and then reflect with theory. And so I think that was important for connecting the dots. The second thing is I would say that I chose with my graduate degree to separate things on purpose. So my graduate degrees are MBA, a traditional Master's of Business Administration, as well as a graduate certificate in Ecological Economics from the Gund Institute. And the reason that I went back to get a traditional MBA at a time when green or sustainable MBAs were just emerging and were kind of a hot topic is that I actually wanted to understand how people in power had been taught and how they were thinking, right? So someone who's progressed already to a senior leadership position, they were not in school at a time when sustainability was a hot topic, and they might not have a strong environmental background, regardless of if they hold environmental and social values in their own life, in their personal life. So my intention was to really understand how they were trained, how they were thinking to some extent, so that I could present arguments in favor of social and environmental responsibility in a language that they would understand and be receptive to, even just to get a foot in the door and have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's really smart. And I think, so I actually went to school for business, obviously nowhere close to an MBA, but there were periods where I was kind of at odds with a lot of my classmates because I didn't hold as much of an understanding of the sustainability side of things as you did, but I had more of a, I guess, green thumb, you could put it. But I do remember one thing standing out where we were asked to write a prompt about what the BP oil spill, like what their PR team did best in response to that like tragedy happening. And my response was like, they didn't do anything well because it shouldn't have happened in the first place, and like trying to do all this stuff to mitigate like their image when they're in reality they're not doing anything to actually try and prevent this stuff in the future. Like in my eyes, that's where I started to see the disconnect of these two sides of what was going on. So what was that like for you trying to put those things together? And I'm assuming that they had to felt very separate when you were going through it.
So I would say that something that I have not experienced is getting much pushback. I've not put myself into an environment where there would be enough pushback on my business case for sustainability, whatever that might be. I've kind of ended up working in, for instance, an internship in sustainable investing where I was at a company that had two mutual funds that were deemed sustainable. And so, it was firmly part of my job to be screening them for social and environmental practices. So I would say maybe that was the biggest instance where I would recommend actually divesting from companies because they weren't meeting our criteria. But the portfolio managers at that firm were well-versed in what it was that we were trying to accomplish and ensuring that we were, claiming sustainability properly. In my other two positions, at the Rainforest Alliance, I would say, although I was in the corporate engagement arm, a lot of the companies that I was working with were in the forestry supply chain. So it could be anyone from an owner-operator logger all the way up through to a Fortune 500 company that was using an FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certified wood or paper product. I would say working with those clients, I often had really, really interesting conversations because they might only be getting certified to FSC in order to meet the needs of their customers and not because it was values that they held. And so I think having those conversations were really helpful for understanding all of the competing interests that a person in any position, it could be that they're the production operations manager at a printing firm, or it could be that they're running a sawmill. And so understanding not just price, but other constraints on a business or other competing priorities that they had to balance, to see how certification doesn't automatically line up with how business is done today and how it was a hurdle in some ways for some businesses to get over. So I think the areas where I've learned the most about how to apply my training are those conversations with people who might disagree or not support kind of the actions that I'm already, proposing.
Gotcha. So then how do you go about working through something like that when something of that nature comes up? I'm assuming it's got to be completely different case by case, depending on, what the business is and what they're trying to do and what they're looking at, right?
Sure. I think a clear example I can take from my current work with Burton. So we have roughly 75 finished good factories that we purchase from at any time. And we have a whole host of sustainability requirements and also preferences that we're incorporating in our products. So whether it's the way that we're designing them, the material choices, or even the manufacturing processes, which we don't own. Those are for purchased goods. And so I have a lot of conversations directly with our suppliers about what it is we need of them. But I always try to start it with, why do we need it? And to kind of present the argument starting from a very high level of, these are values we hold. There is consumer demand and increasing awareness. We want to go beyond regulatory compliance, and then kind of working down to, it impacts the communities that your community, the communities down the supply chain, and really try to make the argument with them that connects not just on my reason for pursuing that sustainability attribute, but kind of the reason that will be relatable for them. So I think the big picture and also making it relatable.
I'm assuming it has to help too to kind of have a company that's more entrenched in an industry like Burton behind you, because you can kind of come in and maybe have a little bit more bargaining power or some sort of weight behind what you're saying compared to someone that's trying to potentially come in and just do something like this right out of the gate.
Yeah, I think depending on the factory, we might not be their biggest customer, but we work really actively across our outdoor and active industry with other brands that might be seen as peers or competitors, to ensure that we're pushing the industry forward. And so I think as long as they hear the same message echoing from many throughout, whether it's the active outdoor industry or increasingly just even fast fashion, that's going to make a huge difference in, the speed at which we can make changes and their willingness to come along on our journey.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see that side of things? Is it kind of a mix of the companies within the industry, kind of all people from each getting in a room and kind of saying, this is where we want to go, mixed with more of an understanding of the fact that consumers are also wanting to push this way? Or what sorts of things are going on to try and, keep that thing moving forward?
Yeah, I think those are two major elements, right? So consumer demand, again, it comes back to profitability. At some point, there are costs associated with certain sustainability moves. And so we need to make sure that we have the backing from consumers and that it's also something that's important to them to kind of drive some of those business arguments. It's definitely the privilege, especially at Burton, of being privately held. So we can, again, act in favor of our values more easily. The active outdoor industry in general is just more active around environmental and social responsibility because we see it, right? Like, especially as snowboarders, we're literally seeing things like climate change through that lens. So we're seeing the snowpack decrease, we're seeing glaciers recede. And so it's something that is, it's something that we have to be passionate about. And so we are taking action. And it's also things like, you know, traditional business pressures like regulatory risk, right? Is there a lot of advocacy activity around, you know, some certain product issue, and does it impact the whole industry? Then we can work together to find solutions. But a lot of the work we do truly is pushing beyond what's required and kind of looking for ways to bring the whole industry forward. Because, and this goes back to your point about working with factories, right? If we go at scale, it's going to be less expensive, it's going to be easier, there are going to be fewer hurdles. And I think with the Outdoor Industry Association, the phrase is "together we are a force." And that's really true when it comes to the sustainability work.
Gotcha. So I want to kind of back up a little bit just because I'm also interested in a lot of the more tactile ways that you go about doing those things, just because it seems like, you know, from a big perspective, someone from the outside might say like, oh, it's just sustainability, you know, it's just trying to do this thing a little bit better or something. But when you start to look at all of these pieces that overarching goal touches, you're really starting to get into almost every single aspect of the business. So moving from your schooling to some of these things, like you had briefly mentioned the rainforest stuff, and then some of your more like, you had mentioned going, I think it was South America, where you were doing some like more in-country stuff. What do you start to do when you're looking at a specific project as you're coming into it? Like specific things of, okay, here's the lay of the land, and then, you know, the steps coming after it.
At Burton specifically, or is that a more general?
I guess more general, and then we can move toward Burton, just because I think it's all kind of pushing that way. But
yeah, I don't think my response would actually change. But well, it's looking at the materiality, right? So that's a combination of what are the, you know, the actual absolute impacts that you can have. How important is the issue to the rest of your stakeholders? I would also say, do you have an ability to impact? So is it worthwhile to spend your time and money or other resources on it? So I think really starting from kind of a brainstorming session of what makes sense for you to tackle, whether it's a personal or a business decision. So from there, I think it's really important to understand not just your stakeholders, but specifically the people that are going to be most impacted and the people that might be taking ownership long term. Because if something's going to be, pardon for using the term, but something's going to be sustainable, right? It's going to be continued into the future. If you want, you know, continuous improvement, then you need to make sure that you're setting up your systems appropriately. So that people feel like they are supported, or that you have, you know, proper solutions in place for the long term. And I think that's the name of the game with sustainability. It's the long term.
That's a good point too. And I think it brings at least my understanding back to what you were talking about with understanding more of the community side of things, because what I've talked about with a lot of people at different companies that I've worked for is when there's a huge turnover and you have a lot of churn with employees, there can be people that have been at a company for 20 years that have a very specific knowledge of certain processes and what's happened previously and what hasn't worked, what's worked. And the second that that person is gone, you lose all of that. And so if you're not paying attention to how you're treating people along the way and you're dumping all these resources into certain projects, now all of a sudden those people are gone, you're back to square one.
Yep.
Just getting a nod.
True.
Cool. So have you ever, is there a difference between working with a privately held company like what you were talking about with Burton versus a more publicly held company where I'm assuming you're probably going to specific stakeholders for specific things, like what you were mentioning with kind of having a brainstorming session about when you're first getting into a project, trying to understand more of what's going on and what their overall goals are. Are there certain people that you tend to talk to more than not within the company itself?
I'd say that it's pretty specific to the project. I think it's important to speak with, the experts to understand the lay of the land. I think that's one thing that you always have to acknowledge as I'll call myself a sustainability generalist, right? Touching so many different aspects of the business. It's important to understand from the people that have, the institutional knowledge, as you referenced, to fully understand the situation, the constraints they're facing, why they make the decisions they make, or why the business has made the decisions it has. And I think that's really an important point, is figuring out the best decision might not always be to jump into the most sustainable decision in the short term, right? Like thinking about what is the long-term plan, what would be most effective, when is the right time, and kind of taking that step by step to ensure that there's going to be long-term success. I think it's really important to, and this really goes for any project, but certainly in sustainability, is to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of time and resources, and that the time is right to make a change. Because the last thing you want is to switch to, for instance, a new product attribute that's more sustainable, but maybe it wasn't ready to go to market. And you don't want to have staff facing that kind of the repercussions and having a bad experience, and then not being as open in the future to making similar changes. So I think that's understanding all of the environment and circumstances around a project before jumping in on planning is really important.
Gotcha. So is there anything in particular, or any project in particular, that you can speak toward that may have been more of a trade-off? I'm assuming that most of them are trade-offs regardless. There's always going to be something that you're having to kind of say, this isn't as important as this other thing that we're trying to do, and what that kind of looks like. Obviously, I don't want to get too deep into any like specifics as far as like trade secrets or anything like that, but potentially just in general.
Sure. I mean, I think that those decisions are happening constantly, and it's not just sustainability. It's, which story does marketing tell? Because we don't want to tell too many messages at one time. It'll get lost. It is, are we going on the product side for a new material innovation that is looking primarily at the performance of a material versus looking at the sustainability of the attribute? So I think that those are just business decisions that are made, again, kind of ongoing. One project that I'm really excited about is we launched the Pass Along program in the US in October of 2018, and that is a new used product take-back program at our retail stores in the US. And that was really interesting because I had the opportunity to work with people really across the business, from our operations team, talking about things like shipping and receiving and warehousing, to finance, issuing gift cards, to our retail team, who's really kind of the front line of interacting with customers and executing the program. and of course marketing. So that was a really great experience to kind of dive all in on a lot of business units, but also a lot of kind of how the operations work at Burton. And that was definitely a process where initially there was some skepticism, right? You start to have a conversation about making changes to how someone does their job or how we carry out our business. And there are some necessary, difficult conversations. And so that ended up in being a great experience in the end, really learning from everyone about why they do what they do, how they do it, and then figuring out how can we make this not just a seamless program for our customers from their experience side, but also how can we ensure that all of our staff that this program touches are also finding it to be a very smooth process and integrate seamlessly.
Yeah. So can you explain a little bit more about exactly what the program is, and then maybe we can dive into a little bit more full in depth, like how that ended up playing itself out and how you moved it along?
Sure. So the program is a pilot, so it's just in the US at our owned retail stores for now. What we're doing is we're taking back used Burton products in certain categories, boards, outerwear, bags. Customers receive a gift card incentive in return, and eventually those products will be cleaned up and resold. We did our first kind of resale pilot at our big annual summer sale last August. We even had some of Donna and Jake's boards in the mix. People didn't know, but it's kind of a fun fact. So, I mean, the purpose of the program is to keep gear in use, right? We're a retailer, we're a manufacturer. We want people to buy our products, but we also want to make sure that they're not collecting them in their closet. So if people are going to buy a new product, we're hoping that they'll ensure that they pass on their old product, their used product. It doesn't matter to us if it's through the pass along program, if it's through a local ski swap, if it's eBay. We just want to make sure that we're providing an opportunity and an easy option for customers to do so. So eventually we're going to clean and resell those products, but we've just kind of started accumulating inventory again since October. And so it's pretty exciting to see things roll in and hear from customers, and we'll see how the program evolves over time.
Gotcha. That's really cool. Yeah, I think it's a thing that's been interesting to me about the clothing industry. And it's also interesting within Burton because obviously there's like different categories from hard goods to soft goods and, this whole slew of product mix. But the clothing industry in particular, how much consumers don't really understand of what goes into each piece of that process and how much stuff they actually have. I think a good example of that is the Marie Kondo, I forget what her last name is, the Netflix thing now, where that blew up, and I hear all these people talking about how amazing it is that they, were able to clean up their closets and stuff. And I'm like, man, I thought this was a no-brainer. Like, I just kind of took that for granted because I do it all the time. But seeing people being like, yeah, I got rid of 3/4 of my closet and I feel so much better. It's like, yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. At UVM in college, there was a course, I didn't take it, but a friend did. And one of the homework assignments was that you had to write down everything that you owned, literally every single thing. And she said that was one of the hardest assignments she's ever done, and that she also felt totally guilty afterward. So you can only imagine as someone grows outside of, beyond the college years and accumulates so much more throughout the course of life. I think the other important thing about the cleaning out your closet, though, is I think that there's a tendency for people to feel like if they drop something off at Goodwill, then it's gone off to, a new use. And in reality, a lot of the things that people pass on, I think, don't end up getting reused necessarily. And there aren't sufficient recycling solutions for things like outerwear. They're very complex. They're made from a variety of different materials. And so it's really important to think about the inputs. So what are you buying? Is it high quality? Is it durable? Can you repair it? Right? With our warranty team, we're working on increasing our repair rate, doubling it from 20 to 40%, meaning that we're going to keep 20% more products in use by spending a little bit more time, care and attention to return the products back to the customer that they sent in versus just replacing them and either recycling or landfilling. So I think really it would be great to see more consumer education, not only on the cleaning out piece, but how do you think about the inputs and manage those? And then how do you care enough about what you're buying that you want to keep it in use personally, and make those repairs yourself and just own less overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it brings me back to the point that you had kind of briefly touched on earlier, which is talking to a lot of the marketing departments within these different businesses and how they're going about putting out a lot of these different messages. Because I think in the outdoor industry itself, there tends to be a lot of like, this is the newest thing, this is the coolest thing, and then things get pushed to the side. And then the sustainability thing seems to be like oh, by the way, we're also, trying to make this a little bit better. And it's kind of like a double-edged sword where you almost have to have that amount of people wanting new things and wanting to really understand more of this stuff, like the Marie Kondo thing. You have to have those people understanding the first piece of it in order to kind of like nudge them to the next piece, which is like, okay, so you felt good about the fact that you were able to pare down a lot of your stuff, but now we got to get you to a point where you can understand where it's actually going and where it came from, and this whole thing surrounding all of it. So it seems like within the last couple of years, and maybe this is just me, but it seems like things are kind of taking that first step that is going to start to kick off like a lot more of these other peripheral things that need to happen in order for a lot more businesses to come full force back into understanding how all these different touch points are coming together. That was a lot.
Yeah, no, and I think it honestly, it comes back to scale again too, right? Like the reason that recycling programs, like true recycling programs, are just starting to grow, in part it's the design of what we're making, and we as an industry need to work on designing products that can more easily become recycled. But it's also a collection issue, right? So going back to your comment about everything that goes into making and distributing a product, well, if we collect the product, then thinking about redistributing it to, centralized warehousing and a processor. And there's just so much that goes into it that doesn't exist at scale right now. So the industry is working to provide solutions for customers to, again, make it an easier experience for them. But we need to make sure that there's demand out there, and it's going to take time to scale these solutions for sure.
Yeah. So let's say you're talking to someone at a coffee shop and somehow you get into the fact that you're in the line of business that you are. How do you end up kind of, I don't want to use the word dumbing down, but how do you simplify the things that you're doing to someone that's like, oh, I'm really interested in this. What sorts of things can I do to try and, either understand it better or look into more of the things that I actually have myself?
I think there's a few points there. One is if you're talking about just leading, a greener lifestyle, a more sustainable lifestyle, again, kind of thinking about what purchases people are making, where things come from, everything that goes into manufacturing. But I think the other point is thinking about how you can, as an individual, leverage your voice to have a bigger impact than yourself, right? Like, so I'm working within a company to try to have a bigger impact than I can have on my own. We as a company are working on things like policy advocacy for climate change to have a bigger impact than we can have on our own as a business. And so just thinking about how to magnify your own impact once you identify what your values are and what you feel is worthwhile spending time and money on, depending on what route you take. How I dumb it down. I think I mean, I think it comes down to, in some sense, simplifying, but also illustrating. So, for instance, talking about things like social responsibility, right? So explaining that we do have products that are made throughout the world and that it's important to us as a company that they're being manufactured in a way that is socially responsible. So someone might not be aware necessarily of labor rights issues that occur in conventional supply chains, or they might not understand that, for instance, like of this garment, 90% of the chemistry roughly that went into manufacturing it got washed out before it made it to the store shelf. And so how is that chemistry being managed, and what is it made of, and who is it impacting? And so just trying to tell more about the story behind the sustainability efforts in a way, again, that's relatable and you can really connect with the person depending on what their line of work is or their background personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like so much of this is just so oriented more towards specifics, where it's completely dependent on the situation that you're facing and, who's in front of you, how you can kind of get to better understand what they care about and how you can make sure that you're presenting them information that actually is getting through. Because it seems like with a lot of the things that I see nowadays, it seems like there's a good portion of it that's just kind of like fluff, for lack of a better word, or like a lot of it's coming from people that don't necessarily understand what goes into following up on a lot of those statements behind the scenes. And so I think that's kind of the message that I want to try and get across to more people, is like how much or and how deep the word sustainability goes, and how it's only really like just started. It's like the industry opened the first door to, a room full of 1,000 other doors, and it's like, okay, have fun now, So it just seems like there's so many things to try and explain to people, and so many conflicting interests, that I think it can get pretty overwhelming for people pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think another way that I try to explain it, at least with what I do now, is really kind of bucketing it. And so talking about products as being our biggest impact on the world. And so we're focusing on how we manufacture products and what we make them out of. Operations. So how do we run our business, like the offices themselves? And then advocacy work, is kind of the big third one. So how are we showing up in the world and sharing our brand values, and just trying to kind of come up with some concrete ways to simplify the message.
Gotcha. So it brings me back to what we had started talking about with the latest Bring Back program that you were talking about for a little bit there. So understanding this whole broader landscape and the fact that there's all these things going on and you want to try and start tackling them, but you really want to make sure that you're going after things that can really make a difference and that need to happen in a time frame that you can actually work with currently. I'm assuming that program that you were talking about is kind of like step one, or one of a first couple steps. Are there other potential ones that are kind of alongside that? And what does it look like for the future of that program itself? And how do you keep all of that going?
I think it's important to approach any program, whether it's new or, ongoing long term, to approach it with a lens of continuous evolution. And so to really find all of the opportunities to have meaningful learning and feedback. And so we're working on that right now with Pass Along to see how we can make sure that we're delivering a program that's valuable to customers and that's valuable to our stores. And it's definitely just the first step for us in this direction. I think as an industry, in addition to reducing the inputs and improving the inputs, we also need to look at how we can design in circularity. And so, I kind of touched on this earlier with the recycling solutions, but really moving toward incorporating design elements to ensure that things can be taken apart easily at the end of their useful life when they really can't be repaired any further. And then, turned into raw materials for new manufacturing. So how can we stop extracting from the earth, particularly for things like polyester materials, if we're going to continue to use them? So I think you're going to see a lot of movement in that direction, again, not just in active outdoors, but also, textiles and footwear, and also hard goods gear. How we bring that to scale is the question right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an ongoing conversation, internally at most big brands, and certainly something that is a topic of conversation with the industry groups as well.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to speak to someone that is trying to start a business from the ground up and may not necessarily have scale right off the bat, but is more so starting as like an individual entrepreneur or something like that, and wants to incorporate some of these understandings and processes in their business right off the bat, would there be specific things that you could that you would suggest to start with, or how would you explain that to someone that's taking a first step as a decision maker themselves?
I envy the startup business person. we are a complex business. We started in 1977. We have soft goods and hard goods. We're trying to steer a ship, and we're making a lot of progress toward these sustainability goals. But if you have the opportunity to start from the ground up, I feel like the world is your oyster in product sustainability right now. I think the circularity point is important, whether it's how you dispose of something or how do you turn it into a new resource, thinking about the end of life before you start thinking about the beginning of the product. So how are you ensuring that what you're creating is not going to have additional harmful impacts at the end of its life? And then kind of backing into how are you going to design? What are you going to use for materials? How are you going to incorporate sustainable packaging? Are you shipping it with the least impactful method? Things like that. I think that there are a lot more resources in recent years popping up for startup companies around these elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what was interesting for me was starting to look at a lot of people within the industry starting to speak out about the polyester side of things more. And I think for me, that may have started with Patagonia and kind of like branched out from there, as I think probably a lot of things within that side of stuff comes from. But it started with looking into more of how those materials break down and how they end up in the water table and things like that, and within wildlife that is around those habitats. But it was also interesting to look into things like cotton and understand, like when it's something that comes from a more of a natural resource to begin with, that it more easily breaks down at the end of its life. But that at the same time, like to your point before, there's trade-offs. So it might not have as much of a performance story around it. And you might have to find, an organic cotton that comes from a smaller yield, so you're not able to scale as much with it. And it's like there's all these tiny little things that end up pulling you in different directions. When something like that's happening, how do you go about evaluating a next step after you've just pulled all this information?
Yeah, I think finding good information sources is important. So, for instance, we use in our hard goods category, primarily for looking at carbon footprint, but we also have other environmental footprint measurements. We use life cycle assessment, or LCA. So really looking at a comparison between materials or manufacturing processes with the lens, kind of at that level where you're able to account for all of the ingredients and processing steps involved in the product. I think there are so many considerations with these trade-offs that
analysis paralysis.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, when you're thinking about a product, you really, when it comes down to it, you have to think about what is the intended use of the product and then back into it, right? So, for instance, does your product need water repellency? If it does need water repellency, what is kind of a preferable version? What is the least impact? Does it need to have, 20 zippers, or would 3 suffice so you can use less metal? These seem like simple things, but really thinking about the intended use is going to drive how you design that product, and what's available to you in terms of the portfolio of sustainability options. So I think just having that intention from the outset is really important, because also, if you design the most sustainable jacket, for instance, but it doesn't meet performance needs, then no customers are going to buy it. And so where are you then?
You negated the purpose of it in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, so then how do you end up trying to weave in more of the business side of it? Because I'm assuming, like, so you're starting to pull all this information, you're analyzing sort of what the best steps are and what the end goal or end use of the product is. Now I'm assuming you have to kind of go to some sort of stakeholder and say, like, this isn't going to impact the business negatively. Or, I would assume in a best case scenario, you can say you're saving this amount of money, so now your margins are this much better. Is that kind of how that ends up playing out?
Yep. There's a lot of players at the table. You need to make sure, like you said, that you're meeting your margin targets, that you're meeting, your sustainability guidelines or goals, that the product can be developed properly, that it will come out as a high quality product given all of the design elements, including the materials. So those are all discussions that have to go on at the appropriate time in the product development cycle.
Seems like lots of discussions.
Yeah. Communication is incredibly important, and also recognizing people's frustrations, their concerns, legitimate concerns throughout the process is really important, because ultimately, at a company, everyone has the same goal. We want to get our customers into really great products that align with their values and ours. And so it's really just a collaborative process for how we get there.
Mm-hmm. So based on your experience so far, have there been any specific instances of, like, a material or a certain way of doing things where you're like, this is the easiest thing that we can kind of target right now, and it's something that you feel like you've kind of hit on multiple times or need to keep hitting on? Because it seems like there's got to be a couple small things like, hey, this specific zipper is terrible, just stop designing into this zipper.
I think that there are some material swap outs that are really easy, as long as the quality of what you're getting meets your standards, and that doesn't vary just by material type. It can be from, back to the farm, from the source it's coming from, all the way up to the mill. So I think moving toward things like organic cotton in place of conventional, or to some extent recycled polyester instead of virgin. Also in our snowboards, so we do this in hard goods as well, right? We've now introduced Super Sap epoxy on all of our boards, which is, the resin itself has a 33% lower carbon footprint than all petroleum alternatives. So finding these kind of low-hanging fruit, it might cost a little more, and so that's the main decision. But if it otherwise meets your needs, that's kind of the easiest first step.
Mm-hmm. So do you see with something like swapping out for organic cotton, do you see any difficulties for further down in the supply chain with farms or mills or anything like that, in terms of, like, if the industry starts to push more toward those things, which it seems like it is for a lot of, when companies like Burton start to push more toward that stuff, is there going to be a difficulty in maintaining supply or maintaining the way that those things are created in order to make that shift within the industry?
If the industry on a whole is vocalizing demand, not just for what we need in this production year, but what our goals are going forward, then we should see growing supply. And so that should mitigate some of those issues. So ideally, no, but I think this is definitely an area where we're probably going to pay more in the shorter term, but longer term, I think you're going to see supply really increase and the impacts on price accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other thing that interests me on that side of things too is how a lot of that stuff gets done, and it seems like a lot of the more responsible or sustainably created products come from things that tend to be more human made versus machine made. Is that necessarily the case or no? Because it seems like when you're thinking of the case that we were just talking about with organic cotton versus cotton, it seems like the cotton side itself is more, you're getting these huge machines coming through fields and it's just this massive, it's all about scale. Whereas organic seems to be a little bit more pared back, more purposeful, less machines. Is that, am I seeing that correctly, or is that kind of a little slanted?
I don't know that that's 100% true. And I do think there's a bit of a lens there for what does sustainability look like?
Mm-hmm.
Like how does it show up? I think to some extent you're right in that we're seeing a shift with more focus on social responsibility specifically, not necessarily tied to the material itself. But certifications like fair trade are really gaining traction in textiles, where previously they were more focused in things like agriculture, particularly for food products. The Fair Labor Association and other multi-stakeholder initiatives around social responsibility. I think these things are all gaining more steam, especially when you look at textiles production, which does have a huge human labor component to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe it might have to do with just the kind of typical handmade label that's put on a lot of things and how that's kind of been blown out and created into something that doesn't necessarily speak to what handmade even really is anymore. It just seems like that kind of turned into a buzzword, and like you can say handmade, but I think regardless of how it's created, you're using some type of tool or machine or something to get it done at some point. So yeah, I think that's maybe just another piece of baggage that's coming along with some old ways of doing things. But yeah, so is there anything else that you kind of would like to talk about in regards to what you do that you think a lot of people might have a misconception of or misunderstanding about?
No, I think you spoke to it earlier. Sustainability is complex for a company. And so it's difficult to communicate it really succinctly and completely, especially with the number of touch points that we have, particularly with customers, but the general public, and with the way that marketing is heading with things like social media, where there's just quick stories on Instagram. You want to make sure that you're genuine and you don't want to come off as anything but. And so I think there's also a level of ensuring you're being careful about how you choose to use your words and photos in those instances. So we're really working to be more transparent and provide the in-depth information about what we're doing for those people that want to go deep. And so definitely keep your eye out. In a few months, we're going to publish some updates on our progress toward our 2020 goals to show that we're progressing toward our commitments. And so I think you're going to see a lot of companies really speaking out more about what they're doing. And in a way, it might create a difficult landscape for consumers to kind of to understand, well, if someone says this is natural, what does that mean versus, this has, the snowboard FSC certified, kind of a verified practice. So just navigating that landscape will be increasingly difficult, but I think that consumers are also willing to put in that work more than ever before, and are really truly starting to make purchases that align more with their values than they have in the past. So that's really exciting to me. And I think that one thing I thought of it kind of after the marketing segment, but the way that we try to clearly communicate our message is our people, our product, and our playground. And so our people is encompassing, everyone that we impact in the world. It's not just our employees, it is our employees. It's all the factory workers. It's also the communities where our products are bought, used, and disposed of. And it's all of our customers and riders. Our product, I think I've touched on a bit, and our playground, that's really our operations and our advocacy work. And so as much as possible, we're just trying to meet our stakeholders where they are, whether it's our customers or our workers, and to provide them opportunities to join us on our journey. And so not just to kind of ride our products, but also to take part in our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's awesome to see because there's a lot going on, and it's a lot to try and handle, because it seems like, specifically with the more social landscape going on nowadays, you take one small step in the direction that people don't like, and there's just huge backlash. So it can be difficult to try and, not only are you balancing all these things internally and within your own job, but then it's like when the company takes a step forward to say, this is what we're doing, it seems like there's always this kind of like nervousness of like, how are people going to take this, and how do we react to potential negative outbursts or something like that.
And I think I don't think consumers understand the power that they have. Like when people write back to us, when they respond, whether it's a social post or they call in on our customer service line, people take notice in this building, and we either respond when we're able directly, or we take it into consideration for our future decisions. So I think I would just say that everyone should be using their voice for their values as much as possible.
I agree. So are you seeing a lot of decent traffic coming to a lot of that site, or that part of the site that's more devoted to the things that you're starting to work on?
The people who want to see it take notice,
Mm-hmm.
I would say. But at the same time, as we become, an increasingly purpose-driven company, and we continue to weave our sustainability values throughout our business, you're also going to see it come through in stories that might not be called out as sustainability stories, right? It's just part of how we're doing business. And so, so hopefully people will kind of learn about all of these many ways that we're interacting with the world in a more sustainable way through all of our posts, all of our articles and web pages.
Mm-hmm. That's the side of it that I've always thought was cool, and I give props to Burton and other companies like Volcom for doing a similar thing, which is like, it seems that the way to kind of push a lot of this forward is to get the message out to kids that are more involved with companies that care about style, because it seems like for a very long time it was the sustainability side of things was seen as more of this like crunchy kind of like old REI type of outdoors person, and now it's cool to see it's starting to seep into more of the popular culture in a way where people actually give it the time of day, instead of just saying like, oh, that's not for me, or I don't understand that, or that's not cool kind of thing.
Yeah, it can be part of your choice, and it's not a trade-off.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. So are you excited for any other stuff coming up? Are there things that you would like to mention? Obviously, you kind of talked a little bit there about more of the marketing side of things, but yeah, is there anything else on the near horizon?
In particular, I'm excited for the Burton US Open next week.
Oh, that's coming up quick.
Yep, snowboarding championships. we run a carbon neutral event, and we are working towards zero waste. And so last year was my first year at the US Open, and I was elbow deep in sorting compost for a lot of the event. So that's more of a personal excitement, and definitely we're all excited at Burton to be out there. But yeah, there's a lot coming down the line, and so I'm just excited to kind of see all of our initiatives coming to fruition. And really it's the work of everyone at Burton, especially our product and events teams and marketing and operations. So I just want to make sure that I'm not taking the credit for that. So yeah, just excited to be here and see what the future holds.
Awesome. So if people want to check more out, whether that's your stuff or Burton or either of the two, where could they go to find more?
Burton.com/sustainability.
Keeping it short and simple. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. This was great. I'll have to check back in the near future and see what more stuff comes up, just because I'm excited to follow along myself.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. It's been really great talking with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.